Hey guys, I'm going to try something new where I do an overview for each dungeon. A lot of the information might be already stuff you know, but I have a lot of friends who started the game late in terms of this expansion, so I've just realized that not everybody knows a lot of the mobs, like they're not familiar with the abilities to interrupt or mobs to skip or where you invis and stuff like that that people learn from doing a lot of Mythic Plus or just doing higher keys. So I figured I would make one per dungeon to see if it might be helpful for other people. So the first mob you come across in Court of Stars is a guard. I'm going to try to not use their full name just because it can get kind of long at times. But he is pretty basic. He only does two abilities. He casts Fortification, which reduces damage taken by him. It is a buff, which can be dispelled or spell stole, either way. But you can interrupt that cast or dispel it. So definitely you don't want that lingering on him. And then he also does Quelling Strike, which is a conal attack, and melee and the tank should just not be standing in that. And really, that's pretty much it for him. So this next pull at times can actually be extremely messy depending on if you let the sentry get to the beacon. So on Fortified Week, you should never pull the sentry unless it's the tank. At higher level keys, the torch that he throws at you will always one-shot you. I've tried to use dispersion while the torch is in the air, and it has still killed me through that damage reduction, which is pretty crazy. So always let the tank pull first. If he's pulling two sentries at once, make sure he pops some cooldowns or the healer has a cooldown on him because he will also die to two torches being on him. But aside from that, there have been times where the sentry is at the beacon getting ready to call, and there's a group right next to the beacon. So even if I do something like Mind Flay that sentry, and he has Shadow or Pain on, so that causes Mind Seer to happen, that will pull those mobs. So you have to be extremely careful. When they're at the beacon, instead of casting something like Mind Flay, if you're playing Shadow Priest, um, just interrupt him, and then after that, he will run back towards you guys as a group. So be patient on that pull and make sure you don't pull the extra pack because it can be really easy to pull that pack if you get in that scenario. So definitely prevent that if possible with stuff like Ursul's Vortex or try to chain stun them and kill them really quickly. Guardian constructs on their own are generally pretty easy to deal with because most of their casts, the dangerous one is Charging Station if they're tanked with other mobs around, but by itself, Charging Station does not need to be interrupted. Um, Suppress is a cast and then it becomes a channel which silences its target, but if you have a healer that is on top of dispels, then you can really just let that cast go and let them dispel extremely quickly. Or, if you have interrupts, go ahead and use one on him. And then aside from that, he has a charge smash ability, which leaves a little cloud on the ground, so you don't want melee or the tank to stand in it after he does that ability. The next pack is pretty simple. It's just a guard with a bunch of mana worms. So the guard is going to have the same abilities as I mentioned before, and then the mana worms will leave a swirling circle on the ground after they die, which will deal damage after a few seconds. So if you're standing in that, you'll take a lot of damage if it's fortified, but avoid those after they die. Mana Sabers are highest priority because they deal a decent amount of damage when they leap towards targets, and it does a small cleave. So you don't want to be stacking with people, especially ranged. When they leap at you, it's a cleave, and it also deals a lot of damage and leaves a magical dot. So this leap can actually be interrupted with stuff like Roar, or maybe you can stun them the second they try to leap out, or even something like Ursul's Vortex works really well for that. But on fortified weeks, they are extremely dangerous, so should be killed first. This next pack is really not that bad. It is more difficult on teaming weeks because there will be two bound energies, and their charged blast cast tends to hit pretty hard if you let them go off on the tank. High priority is definitely to interrupt charging station, every single one of them. You do not want any of those going off because then it's going to heal all the mobs around him for quite a bit. It's a couple seconds buff on the Guardian construct, so it's going to heal them for quite a bit, and you don't want that to go off. So that one should always have an interrupt rotation. The bound energies, charged blast, if it's not fortified weak, it's not that bad to prioritize that second over the charging station. But make sure that if you have someone that dispels, get the fortification off the guard, and that should be it. Normally, before you pull the first boss, if you have an alchemist in the party, they can go up to the vial in the center of the room and interact with it. That way, once the boss reaches roughly 25%, he runs to the vial and drinks from it and just dies. If you don't have an alchemist, you do have to kill him down to 0%. Um, but aside from that, there's also 3 arcane beacons around this room. Normally, what we do is we deactivate 2 and leave 1 up. I believe that if you deactivate every single arcane beacon in the instance, then there's going to be RP right before the last boss, which wastes a ton of time. So that's why you leave 1 up so you don't end up having that go off. But for this boss, it's generally pretty simple. The ad that spawns does cast a stun though, so hopefully he gets interrupted or stunned or something. But there's a stun, and then I'm not sure if they will be fixing this instance or not, but right now, as of this recording, the um, the beams, there's visual indicators on the ground. Um, it's a line as well as conal in front and behind the boss, and you just need to not stand in it. But right now, it's kind of bugged where you won't even be in the indicator, but you'll take a ton of damage, which means that it's not accurate, and it's really hard to avoid right now. But aside from that, if you have a priest in the party, it is amazing because he casts something where it's called Arcane Lockdown, and it's a damage over time magic debuff, and I believe it takes 3 jumps to get rid of it. But with a priest, you can precast Massive Spell and remove it instantly once the debuff is applied. So that is amazing, and that is pretty much the fight overall. For this next part, I definitely feel that imps are one of the hardest packs in this instance because if you don't have a solid stun rotation down and good enough AoE to clear them out before they actually start casting on you guys, it can easily cause a wipe. So usually for them, if you have a bear tank, it's very useful to have the tank roar, disorienting roar, the first cast, and then followed up with a stun, and then another stun, and hopefully by the end of the second stun, they should be dead. Um, for the Inquisitor in this pack, Searing Gaze is very important to interrupt also. Uh, it can be large AoE damage, and along with the imps casting Firebolt or Drifting Embers, it's a lot of damage to the party. Um, Even though there's a lot of imps out, I feel like if there's like a couple remaining and they're channeling Drifting Embers, I just tend to silence one of them. I mean, it's just one out of many, but it is helpful to use interrupts whenever they're available. Okay, so this next part actually has quite a bit of explanation, especially if you're not that familiar with this instance. There will be items located around this small area of the map where, depending on your class and profession, you will be able to interact with these items, and they will either give your party a buff or they will call one of the mini bosses over to you to engage with. So there are 3 mini bosses located around the second boss, and the idea is to pull them away individually and kill them one by one so you can engage her, since they each give her a buff. Um, the only way to pull them away is to either interact with an item that pulls them over, or you kill a Fellbound Enforcer. On fortified weeks, the Fellbound Enforcer should be tanked next to a structure like a pillar or doorway. That way, when they are casting Fell Detonation, your DPS and healer can line of sight the mob to avoid getting that debuff, which is a lot of damage over time. And then once the cast goes off, they can go back into line of sight and continue damaging the mob. All of the mini bosses are really easy. The eye demon guy right here, if it's either fortified or raging and he's under 30%, then whoever he's channeling on, disintegration beam, will need to pop a defensive. Otherwise, they'll probably take a lot of damage, and the healer will need to pop healing cooldowns to top them off, or they'll die. The only new mobs around here are the Shadow Mistress. She's pretty easy. She only applies a magic debuff to someone once in a while, which reduces their movement speed and haste, which is easily dispelled. And then a Fellhound, which leaps at you and leaves a little green patch of crap on the floor, which you don't want to stand in. But the only other tip that I can think about in this area is if when it's teaming Fortified Week, the Bridge pack has two Inquisitors, and I think there are more packs around that have two Inquisitors around, but just based on my experience in the past, I would say I don't really feel like it's really hard to survive that pack because the Inquisitors deal a large amount of AoE damage, and then there's two, and then it's fortified. So I just, unless you guys coordinate your stuns and interrupts absolutely perfectly, and then your healer pops a good amount of healing cooldowns, um, you can most likely live and kill them, but you have to make sure you kill them fast enough to never get cast off. But ideally, you want to skip those packs because they're really risky. I'm not exactly sure how the scaling works anymore, but that experience is based off a Court of Stars Teaming Fortified week above key level 20. So I just recall that our healer would release Spirit basically where we were fighting the mobs, and he would get one shot by either the eyes or it was Searing Gaze or something, but it was just really rough where it was really difficult to stay alive. It's a huge amount of damage all at once, and it's very hard to predict, so that makes it really challenging, and I feel like the chances of wiping on that pack is way higher than clearing them cleanly. Also, when I say Quarter Stars key level over 20, I mean this is before patch 7.2. Once you cleared the area for enough percentage mob wise, the second boss is pretty challenging if you don't have good AoE. Um, the strategy is usually to stack on the tank extremely tightly, um, is best because she will cast something called Infernal Eruption, which will create red circles under your feet, and then a couple seconds after that, they will spawn imps. If you're standing in those circles when they go off, if it's tyrannical, you'll get one shot, but just shift a little bit. And the idea is to move the boss basically to like the edge of the circle so she's standing next to where the imps spawn. That way you can easily cleave off of her to kill the imps. But you want to have a stun rotation. Ideally, you don't want to use more than one stun per group, otherwise you won't have the cooldowns up for subsequent impacts that spawn, and it can lead to your group falling behind and being able to clean up the imps easily. You also want to make sure you interrupt her casts. She casts abilities like Withering Soul, which is a magic debuff. It's applied onto everybody, and it will reduce their maximum health as well as their movement speed. Something like that is easily mass dispelled if you're a priest, but if you get that out, that's pretty dangerous. You don't want it to happen. And aside from that, you can also interrupt Burning Intensity. I believe so. I don't think I'm entirely sure about that one, but I do know Withering Soul is one that you can interrupt. But it's really just a rinse and repeat of you pick a direction that you move as a group, and you just pretty much stay stacked. If the tighter the stack, the closer the imps are together, and just that makes it so much easier to cleave them down. This next part is actually tedious, but the idea is that there are 5 NPCs located around the room that give you a clue as to who you should talk to amongst the suspicious nobles. They're easily identified by having a chat bubble above their head, and they are labeled as a chatty rumor monger. So you can have people just like coordinate ahead of time. Like I'll take top left, top right, bottom left, stuff like that. And then you just go to the mobs and look at um, whether they fit clues. So there's clues such as like if it's a male or a female, whether they have a book on their hip, potions, no gloves, light vest, stuff like that. And you gather 5 clues, it's 5, and then you try to talk to somebody who you think fits that description. If you get the person wrong, you do get kicked out of the party. And I don't know how long you were stunned for outside now. I know it used to be really long. Now they kind of made it shorter. But once you find who it is, they walk up the stairs and either go left or right, and they turn into a demon. The clip was a pretty fast kill since it's Tyrannical Week, but mostly you want to tank the mob facing away from the group for Carrion Swarm, and Dispel Cripple, which, reduces haste and casting speed and all of that. And then Shadow Bolt Volley. Unfortified, I guess I don't think it really one-shots you until the key gets super high. On Raging, it might be smart to pop a cooldown, but I'm still not sure in terms of the new keys um, how high the key has to be yet before it one-shots you. One more quick little tidbit for this guy is after he dies, there's going to be keys that drop on the floor that someone has to right-click in order to unlock the door to the last boss. So what is usually smart is to have someone leave when he's like around 10% and start heading towards the door. That way, once he dies and once someone interacts with the key, they can instantly open the door. The door is about a couple seconds cast or whatever you want to call it, so you want to try to get that open as soon as possible so the last boss can start talking a little bit before he's targetable. The last boss in Court of Stars is really challenging on Tyrannical at high keys, so I think solely because of him, you want to make sure you spec single target for the most part when you run this dungeon, just to make sure that you're able to kill him without letting it go on for too long. For him, there are, I believe, 4 abilities that he has. One is a cloud that you see on the ground, and after it forms, it turns into a little, like a transparent circle on the ground that kind of like shifts around. If you move into that, you get stunned for a couple seconds. He also does a charge at you where they changed it now so it's much easier, but there's a large gray indicator on the ground for where he will dash towards, and he'll do a little like whirlwind. You just want to move away from that. He also does an ability where there are a bunch of gray streaks on the ground, and you just want to make sure that you're not standing in those when it goes off. When it does, it knocks you back and also deals a lot of damage to you. And then his final one, which is the killer for this fight, is Slicing Maelstrom, which is AoE, and it does increasingly more damage per tick as the fight goes on, which is why it's a huge rush to kill him as fast as possible, because later on it becomes really tough to heal through that, even with a bunch of healing cooldowns and stuff. So you just want to make sure that you save heroism for this guy, you have pre-pots and everything, and just go all in. So something that is really important to learn the more you do Mythic Plus, especially when you do high level keys, is knowing when to release and or when to wait for resurrection. Um, this one will be more so geared towards Court of Stars, but I'll try to always cover this topic as I do videos for the other dungeons as well. So basically, I'll try to go through these points, but it's always a little bit situational, and I'll try to go into it a little more. So for the first point, it's basically saying that if mobs are close to dying and there's no chance of a wipe, as well as the fact that somebody is alive that can resurrect you, um, I don't think it's worth it to release if the respawn location is far away, because if they're close to dying, like less than 30%, you're maybe waiting just a couple seconds, whereas if you released and ran back, I think it would take much more time for that. So um, normally I play Shadow, and with, stuff like our haste buff during Void form, and if you're lucky enough to have the Goldan trinket, sometimes my resurrect cast times are like 4 seconds or really, really short. And so it makes me a little sad on the inside when one person dies, the mobs are almost dead, everybody is alive and healthy, and they release pretty far away when I could have gotten them up really quickly. So the second point is that if there's a wipe and the mobs are very close to where you would respawn, you want to wait until everybody is dead and have the mobs reset to their original location before you release. Otherwise, if, 1 to 2 people are dying at a time, and then, you know, it's like a whole cycle of people becoming alive, people dying, people coming alive, the mobs will just stay in combat with you. And you'll just keep dying nonstop and wasting a lot of time with those deaths. So there are times where you want to reset, and the only way to do that is to wait to release, make sure everybody dies, and make sure that the mobs are dropping combat and are running back to where they originally were. The third point can be situational depending on usage of battle reses, but I feel like that's a whole separate topic because I kind of feel like I oftentimes disagree with how easily some people use battle reses in dungeons, but everyone can decide to use their cooldowns the way they want to. But in general, if you die early on a trash pull, um, and the respawn, I mean, even if the respawn is far or it's close, I feel like you should just release right away. That way you can get back to them. Wasting a battle res on something like trash when you have no limitations on being able to release spirit and come back alive again, it just feels a little wasteful to me sometimes because on boss fights, if you die, you're fucked. You can't release, and losing a DPS on a boss fight is pretty extreme compared to trash where there isn't that limitation. So there are scenarios, and I probably won't cover all of them because I can only think of one at the moment, but there are scenarios where if you one person dies on trash, there's a high probability that you wipe and you want to use that battle res. So a good example is Court of Stars. The imps on Fortified hurt really bad. So if you have a class, a DPS class that deals a large amount of AoE damage, and they randomly die super early on that pool, I feel like it's better to battle res that person because you need them to clear that group cleanly. Otherwise, if you're lacking that DPS, then the imps will be alive too long, and the chances of you guys wiping is far greater. The next one happens pretty often, so it's important to consider where uh, if a pull on a boss randomly goes really wrong and someone that has battle res manages to throw it on a healer or just any class that can resurrect and everyone wipes, it's really important that nobody releases because even if it's just one person that releases, you pretty much negated that battle res completely. Because even though there's 4 people that are alive and they didn't release and they got resurrected right by the boss, they still have to wait for that one person that released to run back, and that just wastes a lot of time. Whereas if everybody stayed dead and waited for a mass res or something, they would be able to do another attempt on the boss really quickly. This last point doesn't really apply to Court of Stars, but it's important to keep in mind when you do certain dungeons like Darkheart Thicket or Blackroot Hold, where you often skip mobs, and if you wipe past that point, you don't want to release, especially if you have someone who can stealth back to resurrect everyone. Of course, though, if you wipe and you don't have that option, then everyone will have to release and most likely kill the pack that you skipped. So I hope this video was helpful in terms of maybe um, new tips that you weren't familiar with when it comes to Court of Stars, or just small things like the resurrecting bit I discussed at the end. But please let me know if I said anything incorrect. I'm mostly talking based on experience, and as a DPS or healer off spec that I often play, I might not be entirely familiar with, ability names or um, the way things work in terms of knowing every single item interaction in the area of the map after the first boss. But thanks for watching, and I really hope that you guys learned something new here.